All right, I'm coming to you from my bookshelves today with a purpose. I don't know what I'm doing here. It's been a while since I filmed a video. Let's talk about the books that I've read in 2020 so far. I have a fun list here of all the books that I've read so far in 2020, and I thought it would be fun to do kind of a mid-year book tag. I've seen a mid-year book tag going around, but it's like about best books you've read, worst books you've read, or most disappointing or something like that. But as an author, I have learned that it's not really good form to leave all kinds of reviews as an author because they're your peers, and so I don't know, there's lots of trains of thoughts on this, and I definitely am not perfect. I like to leave reviews, especially if it's a book that I really love. I want to be able to leave a review and tell people about it, and sometimes if a book frustrates me, I have left reviews in the past. But the general rule of thought is that authors shouldn't leave reviews because it's not as professional and it burns bridges and all that. So I generally try to only review books. This is like my happy medium. I generally try to review books that are my favorite, and then the other ones, I am from the opinion that just because they're not for me doesn't mean they're not for somebody else. So like, I don't like all genres, but that doesn't mean those genres are bad. It just means that they're not for me. And so I want to go through this list, and instead of doing like a how I felt about them kind of review thing, I want to share what I have learned from each of these books. And I haven't gone through them in advance, so I'm a little bit nervous about this because I don't know how it's gonna go. I am stopping at 26. So far this year I've read 33 books, but I'm stopping at 26. Yeah? 27? I don't remember. But I'm stopping at the first half of 2020, so January through the end of June. Might have to pull up my Goodreads page to actually figure out where the line is, but we'll get there. Let's start with, this first book. Jessi Elliott is one of my critique partners, and so I got to read this book in January. I think it was this month. I'm trying to remember the month this came out. I think April, I'm pretty sure. I can't remember, but anyway, Twisted Devotion is part of the Twisted series. This is book, hold up, they're out of order. This is book 1, Twisted Fate. These are different characters, but in the same world. So what did I learn? Let's see. I have the worst memory, so how am I gonna do this? I'm nervous already. Ooh, the formatting in here is so pretty. I learn a lot from Jessi because Jessi's my critique partner. So like, I'm thinking of the things that I learned from her are like stuff she's left on my book. So she's taught me a lot, but I have learned a lot about dialogue from this girl because Jessi is a pro at dialogue, and she can set up a world and like a mood or a feeling or whatever else through dialogue so well. I want to get better at writing dialogue like this because dialogue can show you so much about a world or a character or a relationship or whatever you want to convey in like a split second, just one phrase, and you can convey so much that it would take like a whole paragraph to say otherwise. So I love that about this book. So this is my first read. We're gonna have to keep going faster. Should I make like a shelf? Book 2 is my own book. So yeah, this is kind of cheating, but then I was like, no, I did read through it, all of it, in January because I was working on editing. So you do a read through to read it. So it counts, okay? It counts. And I did learn a lot from this. So like, where do I even start? From this one, I'm gonna say the biggest thing that I learned was how awesome fast drafting is, because I fast drafted this more than any other book to date. And so when I got around, this is the very first draft. Hold on one second. I don't know if you're gonna be able to tell, but I added about 20K. So it went from being like 30K to 50K. It's kind of hard to tell on camera, but let's just say it grew a lot. I found that it was way easier for me, at least, to take something like the bones of something and flesh it out and add to it than it was to have something that was so overwritten, which was my first book, and try to like narrow it down and figure out what should stay. That to me is way harder to have an overwritten book and delete stuff than it is to have an underwritten book and add stuff. So they're both difficult, and I have videos on both that I'll link below, but definitely found that I loved having placeholders and fast drafting through this book. It's gonna take me a minute. Whew, okay, I got it out. The next book, third book I read in 2020 was The Tower of Dawn, which is from the, what's it called? Throne of Glass series, right? I was not as huge of a fan of this series, but like I said, I know this has a huge fan base. So just because a book isn't for me doesn't mean it's not for everybody. And I definitely read the whole series through because curiosity, I'm always like, I have to know how it ends. So for this one, I think this is the book where it switched to Kale's point of view quite a bit more. And to the extent that I was really like, but I want to know. I think this is the one that barely showed the main character at all. I think. It's been a while, you guys, my memory's terrible. If I mess up, you know, just let me know in the comments. But I'm pretty sure this is the one where the POV changed drastically and it was unexpected. And so I have done that to readers myself and the Curse Hunter. So one of the things I learned from this is to let your readers know in advance so that they're not like thrown off by it. But also the other thing that I noticed was there was a certain point in here where I hadn't cared really, because it wasn't the character I'd come to know and love. I mean, I liked this character, but it wasn't the same until a certain point, which I can't remember when, but it was a little ways in where I started to find myself caring. And I was like, oh, interesting. What made me suddenly start to care and be invested in the story? And then I wanted to read. And I remember thinking like, that is what you need if you're going to switch a POV, is you need to help readers care right away so that they don't put the book down because it's not their favorite character. You need to find something that's going to make them get invested right away. But yeah, I learned that if you're going to switch POVs, you just really need to make the reader care about them right away so that it still matters. That's what I learned from this. So big next to the other two. Of course, I followed it up with this book because this is the last book in the series. Follows Tower of Dawn, so of course it makes sense. Once I start something, I have to know how it ends. So that's why I was reading this guy. So again, not my favorite series. Don't hate me. I know this is literally like everybody's favorite, so I feel bad. But I did learn a lot from it. One of the things I learned is that you don't need 900 pages to tell a story like this. They could have been cut down, and so it made me take a closer look at my own work. And I have since edited down the Stolen Kingdom a little bit because of thinking to myself, there are some things that are really more distracting than helpful. And so do you want to go into something that's going to pull the reader out of the story? Not really. So things like that, I actually learned a lot from this. And then I also learned a lot about creating, I think it was this book, creating races, and I really enjoyed bringing in some fun stuff into the Cursed Hunter that will really be dug into in the fourth and final book in my series, because I learned a lot about world building from this series. So yes, it's a lot of overwriting in my opinion, but that overwriting did share a lot about the world that made me think about my own world. So that was really cool. This is the fifth book that I read in 2020. This was really, really fun. And the one thing I remember, I immediately knew what I wanted to share here with this one, is that it had a very slow beginning. And my books have a very slow beginning. So once I got into it, I was really, really into it. And I was like, this is really good. But I spent some time thinking about why I had a hard time getting into it at first, and it helped me apply that to the Stolen Kingdom as well. Again, when I went to re-edit it, and I still kind of want to edit it more. Every time I learn new things about writing, I want to go back to my old writing, but at a certain point, you got to move forward. So it showed me that this book was really successful, I believe, and I really, really enjoyed it. So it showed me that just because there's a slow beginning does not mean that it is a bad story, does not mean that readers won't get into it, and does not mean that people won't absolutely love it, because I definitely loved this story. And I know there's a book too, but this one didn't have a huge cliffhanger to make me want to read on immediately. And so I don't know if that's good or bad. I think as a reader that's good, because I really like the closure without being like, I gotta know what happens next. But as an author, it makes me glad that I put in slightly stronger cliffhangers, because that is something that makes you need to get the next book. So I don't know, that's what I learned from this one. I'm gonna talk about these at the same time because I absolutely was obsessed with them. And so of course, as soon as I finished this one, I went to Barnes & Noble immediately and bought this one. I've had a lot of favorite reads in 2020 so far, but I think these are probably my favorite. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I don't know if this just kind of follows it up. I think it's like the whole series, all three books, once the third one comes out, is all considered a Beauty and the Beast retelling. They're kind of heavier to hold up. I don't even know where to start, because I personally love multi-POV books, which this is, and I also really enjoyed that this one dug into other POVs. I can't remember if it even has the POVs from the first book or not. I think it just has two brand new. Oh no, hold up. There is, okay, the epilogue at least has a POV from the first book. So anyway, I was nervous because, like I mentioned with that other series, I don't necessarily like when a book switches POVs, but this one did it really, really well. And so again, I hope that I learned from it, and that I modeled the Cursed Hunter after it, where you switch POVs, but it still really matters, and it still is super intriguing as a reader, because I love this book. I honestly don't know which one I loved more. The other thing I learned from these, without giving too much away, is I really got intrigued by the dragon chapter. And so the Cursed Hunter does have dragon chapters. And I don't know if I would have thought to go there. They were hugely inspired by this, but also by my beta readers who asked me for that POV. But at the same time, would I have written that POV with the same kind of animalistic sense as these books have? I don't know if I would have thought of that, so I have to totally give credit to this author. She is amazing. I love these books. We're gonna run out of room. The next one is The Memory Thief by Lauren Mansy. This one was really fun because there was a heavy amount of world building, and so I really enjoyed the layers of world building and how they all played into each other, and it just kind of blew my mind. Like, when I think about trying to come up with this world building, I would, oh my gosh, it was kind of cool. And then I also really enjoyed that it stepped outside of the stereotypical, is this fantasy? I think it's fantasy. Yeah, I think this would count as fantasy. So it stepped outside of the typical kind of fantasy boundaries, and it went into, it's stealing memories. So it's really about memories and about how the memories impact lives. And it's really, really cool because I just haven't seen anything like this. So this one kind of taught me to go outside of stereotypical fantasy, and I am experimenting with stuff in my new WIP that I feel like it's just kind of helping me to think outside the box. And things like this are really fun because just seeing all the layers of world building too has really helped me think you can definitely build in levels of world building that all play together, and you can make your world building actually connect and interact with each other. So it's not like separate parts, it's like everything in your world is connected. That's a really cool thing that I learned from this. The next series that I read is the Graceling series, or at least I think that's what it's called. I'm gonna talk about this all at once because yes, this is a reread. I have already read this series and I absolutely love it, so I read it again. But this was really fun because I did a buddy read for the very first time of Graceling over in my Patreon group, the Writers Club, which has a Discord room where we chat. And so we had a little channel dedicated to buddy reads, and we talked about this one a lot. And it was really cool because it kind of opened my eyes to how I might see a book one way and be like, this is so empowering and so cool, but not everybody feels that way. Some people see Katza as superpowered is the word, I think, or overpowered, or I can't remember the word now. But anyway, things that I like, not everybody likes. So for me, it was very, very much reassuring as an author to be reminded that like when you get mixed reviews, you can kind of think, oh, the people who like my books are probably just lying and they're just being nice, and it's really everybody hates my books. But it reminded me that even though there are people who dislike books, there are also people like me who absolutely love them, and it doesn't change my mind one bit that somebody else doesn't like this series because I love it. So that was the first encouraging thing. But then the second thing that I noticed when I read these books is that there is a very strong similarity of villains in this series to my series. And I didn't know, I did not realize that my subconscious was pulling from this series when I created the villain and the Stolen Kingdom and some aspects there. And they're very different, so it's not copying, but it's more pulling from fantasy tropes, and that this book has that my series has. For example, the people who are Gracelings in the story are graced with abilities, and in my book they are people with Ginny's blood are gifted with abilities. So obviously it's not the same origin story, it's not the same story at all, but there are still definitely some similarities in this series to mine, and probably in other fantasy series too, because like they say, there's nothing original, we are all just putting our own take on it. But I really was shocked when I read through the series again, because I hadn't read it in, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, something like that, to realize, oh my gosh, my subconscious remembered this. So that was cool. The next book I read in ebook format, so I'll pop it on the screen here so you can see a picture of it. It is She's Not Here by Mandy Lynn. So let me preface this with, I happen to be a huge spelling nerd and proofreading nerd, and that doesn't make me perfect by any means, but I almost always catch at least one typo in every single book that I read, not joking. And to me, I don't mind it. It's funny. It makes me laugh as an author. But when I told Mandy this, that I was kind of a proofreading Nazi, and she was going to do some work on a cover for me, she said, why don't we do a swap where you can proofread, she's not here, and do another pass over it and catch any typos that were missed, and then she could do my cover for free. So we did a fun swap of abilities, or swap of skills, so to speak, which I definitely recommend if you know people in the writing community who can do things that you can't. Definitely try to swap skills because it can be so beneficial and so fun. What I learned from this, actually, because I was approaching it more with an editorial mindset than a reader mindset, I guess you could say, is that it takes a lot more effort to read for errors. Like, I knew that, but it's your brain just skips over things. It's very easy to do. And so what I ended up telling Mandy is that I could only do a certain number of pages per day, and I had to read very slowly and sometimes multiple times. Normally I can read a book in a day, but if you're gonna go into proofreading, editing in any sort of fashion, you'll definitely want to read slower. And so I ended up reading at more of a speed of, I would say, roughly a chapter a day, and it took me a lot longer to read through it, but that's because I would read things multiple times, sometimes even 3 times through, and I would catch things that I didn't catch on the first pass. So what I learned is that there's a different side of your brain that's reading for pleasure than a side of your brain that's reading for typos, which we probably already knew that. Story structure and typos and all kinds of editing things that you really have to kind of bounce back and forth as an author, which was really cool to see because it made me realize that I need to go to my own work with an editor mindset sometimes, and then sometimes with a reader mindset. So I make sure that I'm balancing and making things work well on both sides, if that makes sense. I can't add that to the stack, but the next one is Fawkes, and I have not actually finished reading this yet. This is one of the rare books that I have put down, but not necessarily DNF'd, because I do still remember the storyline as far as I got, and I do want to know what happened. But I think I was just picking up other books at the time. But I guess what I would say that I learned from this, because I put it down, is that it can be really helpful to engage the reader early on in the story and give them some urgent questions that they need the answer to. Because I had some questions in this, don't get me wrong, but I didn't feel like they were quite as urgent, so it didn't bother me to put it down. Like, I still do want to know, I still have questions. But I guess I learned from this that the more urgent a question is, the less likely a reader is to put the book down. This next one is another ebook one, and you might have guessed from looking at my shelves that I'm not a big fan of ebooks, but this was right around when quarantine began and shipping was absolutely terrible, and I didn't have a lot of reads in my TBR. And on top of all that, this is an author that I had been super curious about for a while because she's a friend of mine, and I was just like, I want to see her writing. I want to know how they became USA Today best-selling authors. I'm super curious. It's not really the genre that I usually read. I'm pretty much all fantasy, as you noticed. But this book, when it became free, right at the exact time that I was looking for a new read and I was considering ebooks, I was like, hey, it's free. Let's give it a shot. So without further ado, this series right here by Kennedy Fawkes, I started the very first book in the series. First thing that I've learned is that these authors are genius, okay? They have amazing marketing strategies, and so I don't even know where to start. I am just so impressed with this series because of the marketing strategy. So let me dive into it. These are each of them duets. And so I didn't know what that meant, but I learned that it meant that the first book out of 2 has a massive cliffhanger. And so it's, again, my brain is like, I need to know. I can't just not know. Like, I won't even read a series until they're fully out there if I'm paying attention. That's not always true, but I try not to read a series until they're all published because I can't stand not knowing. And so when I hit the end of the free book, I was thinking to myself, I'm just gonna get a free book. I'm gonna have fun. It's not in my genre, but it'll be fun to read. I had to buy the next one. I have to know what happens. It was a really major cliffhanger, just warning you now. But this was genius, and I learned how effective this is and how amazing the strategy of a free book followed by a cliffhanger that has a bunch more books in the series, because I had to keep reading and finding out each book on after that. And so again, I learned this genius marketing strategy, and I hope to do this when my full series is out someday after the books have been out for a while. And yeah, I'm very impressed. So if you were to apply this to fantasy, you would write about characters that are still in the same world, which I did with a third book in the series, but different than what I did, you would bring them in. Like for example, with The Stolen Kingdom, I brought in Rena, the character in the Ginny Key, at the end of book 1, and so you kind of make the reader want to know what happens there. But I think if I had read these books, I would have done it even better because I understand the idea of almost giving that character a cliffhanger moment for the new character at the end of the old character's book, if that makes sense. This next one is The Stars We Steal by Alexa Dunn, and actually I also read Brightly Burning in June. So I read this one and then I liked her writing so much that I ordered this one as well. But I read them backwards because this is technically book 1. They're not a series exactly from what I gather, they're just in the same world, so they could be considered companion novels. I don't know if Alexa's watching this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I really, really enjoyed this. And reading them backwards, reading this one first and then this one, didn't bother me at all. It just made me wish that maybe I should go back to read this one again now that I knew some things from book 1. Anyway, I absolutely love both of these books, and the thing that I learned from them, honestly, is a lot about the twist or the plot twist. I'm trying to think of the correct writing terminology here. I think it's called the plot twist and the foreshadowing. So they kind of go together. So basically, and it makes sense that Alexa is now writing a thriller because these felt very like thriller paced, and they had these twists and unexpected things that happened that were very, very fascinating to me, but they always felt perfectly set up and foreshadowed so that as soon as you found out about it, you're like, of course, that makes total sense. And it was just really, really fun. So it's hard for me to say which one I liked better because I really enjoy surprises, and I enjoy that perfect setup. It's very, very satisfying to me. I think I like that in all books when you get something that there's a payoff. So I'm gonna pay attention to these in the future because like I said, I read this one very recently and this one not that long ago. So I hope to bring more foreshadowing like this into my writing in the future because this was so much fun. But I also will say that I think it was this one, I was just so into the middle, and you don't find that very often. Usually the beginnings are really strong and the endings are really strong. For this one, I found myself so into the middle of it that I was like, I'm gonna need to study this for the muddy middles, as they say, because it's very fast paced and still interesting, and there's a lot of, you know how the muddy middle can tend to be just a little bit boring? Well, this was not boring. This was very much like something happens, react to it, something else happens, react to it, and it just kept building. And so, yeah, I think building is the best word, and I really enjoyed the way that these stories were built. That's a cool way to say it. The next book I'm gonna slip in there is Save the Cat, and yes, I have read it before, but I read it again in 2020 because I wanted to use it for plotting my own stories, and so I really dig into this a lot. My hubby was like, haven't you read that before? I'm like, yeah, I have. But I don't think this is the kind of book you read just once. I think you come back to it and you glean new information from it every time you read it. So I have learned so much from this that it's really hard to just summarize. So I will just link the playlist below that my critique partner Brittany Wang and I did all about Save the Cat, and we just dug into it. For one thing I have learned from this is that I am actually more of a pantser than I realized. I really, really love the Save the Cat beats, the 15 beats in this story, and I like to plot out just that much, not much more. And I like to just dive into the story, and then often I will find that my beats start to change, and that's okay. And so I actually like to use this for editing just as much as I do for drafting, and I find this very valuable as somebody who's a bit more of a pantser than I realized. The next one I read, I have already borrowed out to a friend because it's a very well-known book. You're gonna recognize it right away. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. And so this, as you probably all know, is the prequel to the Hunger Games series. So as soon as I heard about it, I was like, yeah, I need to read that. For me, it was a very tough read. There are some things in there that just, it was hard for me to read. But that said, it was very well written. Again, talking about foreshadowing and setup and just seeing it all line up and build perfectly on itself was very, very interesting to see as an author, because even though I didn't like the character and I did not enjoy his mind, I still thought the author did a really brilliant job of showing an arc into being a villain that I have not seen, I don't think, anywhere else. I have read one other villain story. Heartless by Marissa Meyer is another villain story that I read, but I'm pretty sure Heartless ended right at that turning point into becoming a villain, whereas this prequel definitely began with the turning point of becoming a villain and went way deeper into what that looked like. And so I am working on writing something for my patrons this month, hopefully, in the Stolen Kingdom series. And I have outlined what I think his story is going to be, and it kind of was like, that's, oh wow, like that makes total sense. It makes you understand a villain so much more, even if you don't agree with anything they did or any of their decisions and you're like, I would never ever do that, that's not okay. It's sort of interesting to see like, oh, that's the thought process. I guess I would say that I have learned a lot more about writing a villain that I haven't put into play yet, so I don't know what that's gonna look like. But I have also learned that the villain story is just as important as the hero story because they really do play off each other and impact each other in a very important way. I can't add it to the stack though. The next book I read was Everything by Nicola Yoon, and so this one, honestly, this is probably my other favorite of 2020 so far. It's not in my genre, so I wasn't sure if I would like it. It's more contemporary, but I was obsessed with this. I read it in a day. Like literally, it came around 4 in the afternoon and I finished around 4 a.m. So I definitely couldn't stop reading, which is a good sign for me. And I just want to show you the thing that I learned from this is formatting. So I'm just gonna skip around, like to include images in your story, or to have chapters like this that are super short, but they have such a punch. It's like, the formatting of this just kind of blew my mind as an author, like emails. Or no, that was sorry. Credit card application, Post-it note, a neighborhood watch, a letter, an airline ticket, postcard, pictures of fish, a dream spiral. Look at that. That chapter was 1 line. So this just breaks all the rules in the best way possible, in a way that just, literally, it blew my mind. I was like, I absolutely love this story because it's not what you expect at all. It's such a powerful story, but it doesn't tell it in the way that you expect. It conveys strong emotions through things like a neighborhood watch or a dream spiral or things like that. It's like, it's amazing. I don't have words. This one, and also probably I would have to give credit to Holly Black, has inspired some of my choices in formatting, specifically the epilogue of The Cursed Hunter, and how sometimes less is more. The one thing that I will say about this is that when you are reading a story through emails, you can't convey the same emotions. I'm not gonna say the same amount because it still conveyed a lot of emotions, but it conveyed them in a very different way. Because if you had the full story, like narration and specifically the scene setting where you can see their body language and how they react, so I didn't get as much of how the characters feel through this type of storytelling, but at the same time it was so powerful how it conveyed things in a very different way, almost in a much more I'm living this kind of way. It was very hard to just tell. It showed everything. So that was really cool. And just the way that this story broke rules and became even better for it, I was really excited about that. So this definitely is one of my favorite reads of 2020 so far. Highly recommend it. The next one is another ebook right here. This one came up in my also bought on Amazon. So I don't know if you guys know this, I won't dig into it really deeply, but when you go to do ads like Amazon ads or BookBub ads, it can help to really dig into your also boughts and look at other books that are similar to yours, other authors that are similar to you, and really get a good grasp of where your book lands so that you can find readers who liked that book that will like your book. And so the cool thing about this was that I believe it is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but it's so drastically different from mine and from A Curse So Dark and Lonely. And I haven't read a lot of Beauty and the Beast retellings, I don't think so. But what I noticed about this one was that, like for me, when I did a retelling, I took a lot of the structure of the fairy tale and tried to build that in, whereas this one took more literal details, like the fact that he was actually a beast and they were actually in what's the word, the French word? I'm gonna know it when I go to edit this video, but I can't think of it right now. But anyway, the same sort of castle-like design, but it's French, and there were French words in there and just things like that. So anyway, it was really fun to read another retelling that was just such a different take on it. Like, everybody has such a different take on the same story that it just goes to show that, again, while nothing is original, you can still put your own take on it, which I absolutely love seeing that. That's one thing I learned. And then another thing that I learned, I would say, is that even though there were some plot holes in this that bugged me, it wasn't enough to stop me from reading because the story itself was so interesting. And again, it was all about those questions. There were so many really good, urgent questions, or just say something frustrated me about where the character was and it didn't feel well explained, or the world building didn't feel well explained. I still needed to know the answer to this question enough that I kept reading. And then I forgot about being frustrated with that because I was like, ooh, this is interesting and I'm really enjoying the answer to my question, and more questions came up. So I guess one of the things I could say about all of these books that I have slowly been starting to just pick up over time, and as I'm talking to you guys right now, I'm hearing a theme, is that if you ask questions and then you bring answers and then more questions and then you continue that kind of question answer roller coaster, so to speak, is very much intriguing, and it can make a story, it can make you want to keep reading. Like, if you're constantly having new questions, but you're also getting them answered in a very satisfying way. That's the balance that I want to try to strike as an author, is to immediately start with exciting questions, immediately start answering them so that things are still interesting and you're not like, I'm bored, I still don't know, I still haven't gotten my answer. That's not fun either. So kind of striking that really nice balance is what I love most about stories, I think. The next one that I read was A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. This one, a lot of you have heard about this because this is a brand new release that I think hit the New York Times bestseller list. There were some things that I didn't like about it, but some things that I did like about it. So I learned a lot from both, from the things I didn't like and the things I did. So the first thing is that there's a ton of world building in here, like a ton of world building. So maybe it's because I'm an author, I read with more of a critical eye, but whenever there's a lot of world building and it becomes almost, to me, it becomes almost info dumpy. And so I get a little sidetracked with my author brain going, you could have slipped that in a little bit differently. And like, my brain will try to rewrite it. So that's the first thing, is that I probably was reading a little bit more with an author brain than a reader brain, which I just do with all books now, and it's a problem. But I will say that I really enjoyed, again, the layers that were built into this. There was so much more depth to this that you could tell there was a lot under the surface, and it all worked together in a really nice way. So I always appreciate seeing world building that works together, and it almost creates who the characters are. But one thing I did learn from this that I am guilty of doing as well is making the world building come before the characters. And so that's one of my things, is that I am all about creating the world first as an author, and then I plug the characters into it. And so saying all this with a grain of salt, because I am guilty of this too, but I did notice that the characters seemed almost a little bit secondary sometimes, and there were points where I felt like I didn't connect to them as much. And so that made me think of Save the Cat, where if the main character in here could have had a moment where they did something to essentially save the cat, so to speak, using that terminology, I think I would have connected sooner. They were really cool characters, but again, they just felt a little bit secondary to the plot. And so that was something I learned from this. My eyes are open to it with my own writing, hopefully more, and hopefully books like this can make me catch myself and go, okay, the character should come first, because I have noticed that despite writing more world building side, I tend to, as a reader, prefer character driven stories. And I have found that most people do, not everybody. There are people, again, every book is for somebody different. So just because a book isn't for me doesn't mean it's not for somebody else. But a lot of people that I've talked to prefer character-driven stories, and I've realized over time that I prefer that as well, but I tend to write more world-building stories, so I hope that makes sense. Another example was there are a lot of words brought into this that are really cool, and I personally happen to be somebody who loves fantasy words being brought in, or words from other cultures. And if you've read the Stolen Kingdom series, you already know that. You know that there's a whole glossary in the back of words that I've slipped into the story. But the one thing that I noticed in this story again, with the author mindset that I'm not sure about in my story, that makes me nervous for mine, is that there were some instances where a word was brought in, but then like 5 chapters later, it was brought in again with no explanation, and I could not remember what they were talking about. And there was also a couple instances where a word was introduced, and so the idea as a writer is that you want to introduce it with context around it so that the reader can just pick up what it means, right? But there was at least one in here that I never quite knew what it meant, and so it's not the end of the world. It's fine. I'm pretty sure I've probably done this myself as well, so this is why it's eye-opening and a lesson learned that if we're going to introduce new words as an author, we really, really need to make sure that they are slipped in seamlessly and that the reader knows from the context around them what they are, and that if you're going to bring them in again, something I did not realize when I did this, and so I kind of want to go back and look at my books, is that you might really need to reintroduce at least a second time or even a third time, depending on how widely spaced they are in the story. If they're right next to each other, even the same chapter, it's probably okay, but like having a few chapters in between, definitely forgot as a reader, and so I need to remember that for my future stories. Last but not least, I'm going to slip in this book, which is another ebook that I have, and I got this for free a long time ago, but again, I am not an ebook person and I forget that I have ebooks, so I have a lot of ebooks that I have not read or have only read a couple pages and then I forgot they existed. So because of quarantine, I became aware of this book. This is such a fun read and it's so eye-opening. It actually helped me with the 4th book in my series, which I'm currently working on, The Enchanted Crown. It helped me when Save the Cat wasn't helping anymore. In The Enchanted Crown, book 4 in the series, I have way too many characters, and it's the Save the Cat method was working for me to a point, but it wasn't enough, and I had certain places that I was feeling stuck. So this book has taught me so much about things like the pinch points, for example. Reading this one, I think probably my favorite thing. I haven't finished it yet. I'm right in the middle of it, but I'm counting it because it was so good. It's worth mentioning. This one, I really enjoyed how it broke down different parts of story structure in a totally different way to kind of open my eyes to what I needed to change and edit in my story, because I was totally stuck and I was working on edits and trying to re-outline my story, and I was like, I don't know what it needs. It's not just coming to me naturally. So this book talks about pinch points, and I think actually going back to Brightly Burning and how I said that the middle of that was really good, I was reading that around the same time I started reading this book, and so I realized that for example, in the middle of her book, she has pinch points. And so these pinch points are sort of reactionary moments where smaller things happen and the character reacts to them. And it's in these big gaps that the Save the Cat book has, which is fine, but they just felt like these big gaps and they were kind of boring. And so reading about the pinch points helped me to see where I could put some pinch points in my story. And that leads to, last but not least, The Enchanted Crown, which I just did a printout this time because I didn't have the full wrap to print out a proof copy. But this is the very first draft of The Enchanted Crown, and so I did a fast read through of this so that I could start editing and begin that process. So what I've learned from this book is that I have a lot of editing to do, especially from what I've learned from all of these books. That is quite the stack, and it's missing a few because of course I didn't have all the ebooks in there. Huh. Oh my gosh. And that will have to work for a thumbnail. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that didn't make you sad when you saw the books crash and burn. Definitely subscribe if you haven't, give this video a thumbs up, and I hope you have an awesome day. I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye!